My name is Jeffrey Sampler. I'm a professor of management practice at the China Europe International Business School. I've been at CEBS for 10 years now. Before that, I was at Said Business School at University of Oxford and then the London Business School. My teaching and research is at the intersection between strategy and tech. I'm an advisor to many large companies, and I've been on the board of startups as well as FTSE 100 companies. Recently, in our world today, it seems that we're encountering unprecedented and seemingly unending series of phenomena that are just shaking us. Before, these were called black swans, but maybe now we should be calling them rogue waves. From global pandemics, war, shifting geopolitics, trade disputes, and it seems there's something new in the headlines every day. These events have produced dire consequences for many people around the world. Supply chain shutdowns or disruption, food and energy shortage, inflation coming back for the first time in many people's memory. And we really don't know, organizations, individuals, and even governments in some case don't know what to do and are pushing the panic button. To help us calm down, we are joined by Jonathan Brill to give us insights and soothing words of wisdom from Silicon Valley. Jonathan holds a degree in industrial design from the Pratt Institute. He spent years as a research consultant at the MIT Media Lab, and he more recently was also a global futurist at Hewlett Packard. And most importantly, he's the author of a new book entitled Rogue Waves, Future-Proofing Your Business to Survive and Profit from Radical Change. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jonathan.
So thank you for having us here, and to everyone in China, thank you for being around.
Very good. I was wondering if you could maybe give us because I know you have such a rich background. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself, and then maybe tell us how you became interested in this topic of surviving and profiting in times of radical change.
Thanks for the question. So I spent most of my career helping organizations figure out how to be more innovative. I've helped bring 325 products from idea to market as managing director of innovation consultancies. About 5 years ago now, HP called me, the computer company, major global competitor to Lenovo, and said, we need some help figuring out how to ensure that we're going to be worth more 10 years from now than we are today. How do we do that? And I got in and I thought I was going to be the future product guy. But then I realized that there were all of these decisions about the future and all of this information about the future that needed to be analyzed to make better decisions about investment across the firm in terms of location strategy, personnel, skills and workforce, how we were going to go to market as the world changed, so on and so forth. And so my job, my role really shifted from being the product guy to helping companies figure out how to drive more long-term value. And it turns out in a recent 2000 company cross-sectoral study by McKinsey across a 13-year period, that companies that invest in resilience, that invest in the long term, they have 81% higher economic profits over time. And so if you want to invest reliably in innovation, perhaps the secret isn't the next cool button, and the secret isn't just how to have a more spectacular product next year. It's how to be resilient no matter what happens next. And so much of the time, Jeffrey, you were talking about the idea of the black swan. When bad things happen, when radical change happens, we say, I couldn't have known about that. Well, the reality is that's actually not true. And when you talk to Nassim Taleb, who defined that term black swan, what he would say is that many of the events that we see, whether it's a 2008 financial crash, whether it's COVID, these things were more knowable and calculable than we would imagine if you take that bigger perspective, that the look at the larger scope of history, when you start looking at all of these little things that are changing and how they combined to create radical change. So when you think about the global explosion of COVID, right? 10, 15 years ago, we dealt with, new respiratory pandemics, right? We had some idea how to deal with these things. And yet the world changed, right? We got more connected, the population density in cities increased. So the time at which we had to contain this thing, it shrank. And that's independent of, any policy decision, any ability to respond. The time window in which we had to respond to this thing shrank. And so we got hit. Like it was an inevitability of the combination of change. And so when you think about a rogue wave, right, in the deep ocean, you see large waves all the time, but occasionally a 120 foot or a 30, 40 meter tall wave will pop up, absolutely out of nowhere. And I love the Chinese translation, the Mandarin translation of this. It's not a rogue wave, it's a mad dog wave. It's a crazy dog wave. I love that translation. And these things pop up seemingly out of nowhere, but they're the result of individually manageable waves of disruption colliding in the same time, in the same place. As the world gets more connected, as the world moves faster, there's every reason to believe that we're going to see more of these rogue waves, more of these mad dog waves appearing out of nowhere. And so if we look at the pieces, the constituent pieces of what will cause the next disruption, even though we don't necessarily know the seed event, we can know a whole lot about it. We know that we're going to continue to see the rise of Asia. We're going to continue to see the rise of the Western level middle class across Asia. That's going to cause resource demands. It's going to cause whole new infrastructure concepts. It's going to cause an explosion. It is causing an explosion of innovation across Asia and increasingly across India. We know that the artificial intelligence and automation are going to shift the nature of what we do in our jobs. I was trained as an industrial designer. Today, if you take a look at some of these new AI tools, these things I had to spend years learning how to draw, how to manually do drafting with, do 3D CAD with. In 5 years, 10 years, we're going to ask our computer to make a thing that looks like a car designed by Apple. And while it won't be able to do all of the work, a lot of that conceptual work that I was trained to do will be automated, right? A lot of the high value work that I was trained to do will be automated. And that's a structural shift, right? That the creation of intellectual property is going to increasingly be done by machines instead of people. When you take a look at that, just that combination of events, we're moving into a radically different future of work. We're moving into a radically different future of innovation. We're moving into a different future of labor. And the way that you stimulate, you govern, you manage the economy in that situation has to be radically different too. And so when you take a look at these individual parts, they're individually manageable. We don't know what will cause the next dramatic event, but we know a lot about what the world will look like after. And if we start to prepare ourselves for what the world looks like after, if we make small decisions today that increase our options and our potential, no matter what happens, right? Looking at that bigger picture, the likelihood of long-term success is dramatically greater.
Let me, you've brought up many interesting perspectives. So let me try to tease out a couple of threads, and then let's dive back in to wherever you'd like. I mean, at one level, what you've just said about the intellectual substitution, of machines for people, et cetera, it's industrial revolution all over again, right? Except with the Luddites, right? The machines were taking away my job as a worker. But now, instead of physical labor, it's intellectual labor that's being substituted. And I remember when my youngest daughter, was like in 3rd grade, and she, we were learning the multiplication table, and she just stomped her foot down and she said, "Why am I filling my head with something that I can punch on my phone and get an answer instantaneously?" And I think what you're highlighting is a broader trend that, from, the mouth of babes, why am I spending time learning and doing things that machines can do faster, better, easier? My capacity as an individual should be spent elsewhere, right? And I think that's really interesting as we think about the next generation of products, et cetera. The other thread that I find fascinating, particularly as we think about the frequency and maybe the size of rogue waves, is that it's impossible to be an island in today's world. Everyone is interconnected. And so, if you look at historically, any military problem, 9/11, Pearl Harbor, whatever, everybody says, oh my God, we didn't see that. But there were many weak signals, but the problem is they were not integrated, they were isolated. And so people thought it was a one-off, but instead in aggregate, it was quite frequent. So the more interconnected things are, the more frequently we should see this, but also the bigger potential seismic impact of these things because it's more potential energy behind it. So how do we deal with this opportunity threat? And I guess the other thing is how do you tell companies that are publicly listed and have to manage quarterly expectations to think long term also? How do they manage these dualities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the first thing to remember is that when you look at risk, when you think about risk, we think about it all wrong. When you measure risk, right, the primary measure is beta, it's change over time. Well, that means that when you look at risk, when you think about how to manage it, what you're really talking about is how do we create exponential growth? How do we ride these waves? How do we sit on top of them? Or when we get hit, right, how do we flip our kayaks faster than the competition? Because as we all know, when everybody else is capsized, when everybody else is trying to backfill their systems, that's blue ocean for the companies that are ready to take advantage of it. I don't know exactly the companies that won in China over the first round of COVID here, but in the US, companies like Zoom, we're doing this recording on Zoom, they saw 26 times growth. And yet at the beginning of this, Microsoft, which owns Teams and Skype, two major video conferencing platforms in the US, they already had the services, the contracts, the software on our devices. And yet Zoom was ready to take advantage of this moment and they won. Whereas Microsoft has now got to spend 5 or 7 years probably backfilling, trying to pick up the market share that they lost as a process. These moments of change, whether it's a world war, the companies that went into World War I, the old money that went into World War I, certainly didn't come out of World War II, with the same political status. Most of them didn't come out of World War I with the same political status. Same thing going into World War II, same thing going on around the world. When these major disruptions happen, that's when the new winners are created. And so when you think about, as a publicly listed company, how do I do this? How do I think about this? First of all, the conversation, the real conversation to be having with investors is, what is the likelihood of anybody consistently hitting their quarters? Anyone, right? When Rita McGrath did a study over a 10-year period, and I think it was something like 1 in 2,500 or 1 in 2,000, hit their quarter, hit every quarter, right? It's not a possible thing to do. So the question really is, how do you, in a world of increasing structural growth constraints, certainly in the US, certainly in Europe, to some extent in China, how do you take advantage of those disruptions? Because that's when your growth happens. The companies that they go through these bumps come out of them faster. According to a recent study by BCG, by Martin Reeves, suggests that they do about 39% higher growth coming out of that, and they continue to capture that growth after the disruptive event. And so when we think about growth, I think we need to first of all educate our investors that there's this other way to think about it that actually creates more reliable growth in times of disruption. That we need to think about how do we take advantage of the disruption instead of just how do we manage it. The second piece is, so much of the time, this isn't an economic cost, it's a mindset shift. We all make optimization decisions as mid-level managers. That's foundationally our job, right? How do we move faster, better, cheaper? And the bigger question is, do those middle managers, do we understand the larger operating context in which we exist? Do we understand the ecosystem in which we exist? So when we make this small decision here, we're making a decision that increases our optionality and our potential over time. And so it's not just about how do we put bigger buffers in our supply chains. It's not just about, how do we create policy that mitigates against change and gives us time to change. Those things can be inefficient, but it's also about how do we make more innovative decisions at every step of the day, assuming that the world will be foundationally different than it is today, than that it has been in our professional experience. When you start from that perspective, you make very different decisions that can often result, when the world changes, in very different outcomes.
I couldn't agree more, but then that leads to a couple of fundamental questions, I think.
Right.
That I would love some, that I think every company is struggling with. I don't care which part of the world they're in. Everybody sees the chaos, the change, the unpredictability, the surprise, right? I didn't see this coming. They should have, but they didn't. So now that they believe you, they've read the book, they've taken the medicine, I got it, they believe. But two challenges, not problems, two challenges. And I'm sure you've worked with companies around these issues. I believe the world is going to be subject to more and more rogue waves, as we're talking about, and maybe even bigger rogue waves. How do I make long-term investments in a world of unpredictability and change? That's question number one. And number two, do I need different financial tools and models? Because you could argue that net present value is talking about the predictability of earnings into the future, et cetera, et cetera. The problem that I have, and your book, I think, exactly highlights that, is anytime you're looking at a 10-year investment horizon, so much of the risk is qualitative, not quantitative. And so therefore it doesn't fit into my model. So how do companies start to think about qualitative risk in a serious manner, rather than just, well, the numbers told me this, when we all realize that in many ways it's sitting on a flawed foundation. And so it's the garbage in, garbage out. So how do I handle making long-term investments, which I know are necessary for growth, but if I invest the wrong way, I look stupid. But yet, and how do I break out of the financial shackles that the stock market puts me in?
Sure. These are great questions. And so the first thing to consider is that, maybe the future is far more disruptive than today. I happen to believe that to be the case. But the bigger question is, do you believe that you're prepared for the past? When I work with large companies, the first thing that I do is I say, okay, let's pick a decade, any decade of the 20th century, 1900 to 1910, 1930 to 1940. And let's assume the world moves a little faster than it did in the past. So let's say that in 10 years in 1900 is 5 years today. So are you prepared for the US to take a major Pacific island chain? Are you prepared for the invention of something as dramatic as air conditioning and refrigeration? Are you prepared for something as dramatic as the invention of antibiotics and the Bosch-Haber process that they enabled us to do things like create fertilizer? Are you prepared for that scale of change? Because that happened over a 10-year period. And if you think that that's a nonsense scale of change, let's pick another decade of the 20th century. Once you start taking a look at 2 or 3 decades, what you start to realize is the scale of social, economic, technological, and political change that is likely to happen, right? It's the statistically likely to happen. We have to deal with uncertainty, things that could happen next. But if we are prepared to deal with the kinds of things that we know are likely to happen, the range of change that we know is likely to happen, then we're starting from behind. So that's the first thing I do. The second thing that happens whenever I bring this up, as well, is that responsible managers say, hey, you can't prepare for every rogue wave. That's crazy. We had a solar flare event. We had famines. We had whatever happened. We can't prepare for all, a meteor to hit the Earth. That's crazy. And my answer is, you're right, you can't. But what you can do is you can take a look at what consistently impacts your organization. There are 4 major buckets of risk, right? There's financial risk, there's operational risk, there's external or exogenous risk, and there's strategic risk. What happens if things like our demand forecasts are off? And what you discover when you take a look at a combination of these sorts of events, and you take a look at what would happen if they happened in parallel, what you discover is they consistently hit our finances, our operations, our external environment, and our strategy, what I call the 4 foes, in consistent ways. There are consistent shapes of pressure on your organization. And so when you take a look at how do I do process innovation, the thing you want to look at is, where are the major shifts, where are the major drivers in process innovation? And then when you take a look outside at your market, if you take a look outside at your customers, how will these kinds of changes impact them? That starts to define what is your longer term product innovation window. And so I'm not suggesting that we all need to magically see the future 10 years from now. All I'm suggesting is that we need to prepare for the range of change that we know is historically possible. And then we can start to figure out the range of change that happens next.
And what about to break out of the financial logic, the handcuffs that quite often the capital markets get us into? How do it's almost like we have to re-educate them, for this kind of world. How and I'm sure you've worked with many companies on that. So what are the insights that you can give us that really help us to break that conundrum, that Gordian knot, right? How do we break that?
Yeah. So as the global futurist at HP, we had this exact challenge. You might know Carl Icahn. He's probably the most successful investor in the West, more successful actually than Warren Buffett over time. And he comes and he breaks up firms. He's an activist investor. So the thing I like to ask is, like, what's going to keep Carl Icahn from coming to dinner? And I say that very specifically because at HP, that was the concern. We were a value-driven stock. We were optimized for the quarter. All of the things that you're talking about were true. Our operational financial intelligence or channel intelligence weren't quite where they needed to be. Our leaders were operating blind. All of the things that are pretty typical in mature organizations were there too. And we were terrified that Carl Icahn was going to come to dinner because we didn't hit our quarter. And guess what happened? We didn't hit our quarter, and Carl Icahn came to dinner, and something really interesting happened. We'd spent a lot of time over the last couple of years optimizing the firm. We let about 16% of the workforce go. We optimized our location strategy. We'd been focusing on how do we deal with digital channels of the type that you see in China with Taobao and JD.com and so forth, so on and so forth, coming into the enterprise market and changing the rest of the world as well. So we've been shifting, we've been reorganizing against these types of issues. And so we were getting cost efficiency gains, but the growth wasn't quite there, wasn't quite where it needed to be. So Carl Icahn came to dinner and said, hey, I want to link you up with Xerox, which is the largest US pure competitor. It's like Lexmark in China, which I think is partially owned by Lenovo. I'm not sure the whole organizational structure, but it's a large office printing company. And HP has a large printer division, which creates the majority of the revenue or the margin historically, not its PC business. So I said, all right, we're going to link you two up. And investors thought it was a great idea. And then COVID happened and something really interesting occurred, which is that HP's stock price and its revenue went to all-time highs, whereas Xerox's earnings per share dropped 69% and stayed there. And so my point is, in those moments where there's disruption, That's where the growth occurs. That's where the winners consolidate, right? And B, that's what you want to prepare for, are those moments of disruption, those moments of change. And what you want to tell stockholders, shareholders, is you don't get to decide when those moments happen, but those moments are when the industry changes. Those moments are when the industry shifts, not the day-to-day, not the good times. And the good times, you're competing for points, but that's not the real value. That goes up and down. It's are you ready for those disruptions? That's when the win occurs. And you want to think about, what's your investor mix? Can we find an investor mix that's willing to make those bets, and the statistically knowable future, right? That we're going to see more disruptions than the made up future where we know exactly what it's going to be.
I mean, I think what you've just said, at least the CEOs that I'm familiar with, the best ones I've seen, have this skill that they say, my job is not just to do quarterly micromanagement,
Right.
but it's to educate the investors on our perspective of the future.
Mm-hmm.
So that they're ready to go on that journey with us. And, we're not going to get it right on it, but we agree the end point. And you can't micromanage me. And I find I think that's a skill set that
Mm-hmm.
in a rogue wave environment is going to be
Right.
more and more critical for CXOs to have. It's that kind of shifting and the ability to take that journey into an unknown future together. What have you seen?
I think that's exactly true. The second thing I would say is that the way that you're going to successfully take that journey into the unknown future is by devolving more command and control down to lower layers of the organization, so that they can reorganize, so that they can innovate faster than you as a CXO can necessarily tell them what to do, right? So down lower in the organization, you need to have better executive communication skills, executive judgment skills, environmental intelligence. So that the people who are your hamster wheel runners, your crank turners, right, are understanding why they're turning the crank. If you're the captain of a ship, if you want the people in the engine room to innovate for you, they need to know what's going on in the ocean. Interesting story that I discovered in researching the book. And this is the Western version, the English version. Captain of the Titanic, 90 minutes after the Titanic had hit its iceberg, had not informed the vast majority of the crew that had happened. And what you hear in documentaries and so on and so forth is, there weren't enough lifeboats for everybody, so everybody died. The more important story is that not all the lifeboats were taken down because people weren't properly trained to take the lifeboats down, and people didn't know to get off the ship. And so as a captain, your responsibility in times of radical change is A, to make sure that people are prepared to take advantage of it, and B, to make sure that people are informed when the world changes. And that's not just your investors, that's also your people.
Right. I mean, again, I think more and more successful companies that I see, and I love your insights on this, is they're able to manage dualities, right? Mm-hmm. And so, for example, what you were just saying is, I fully believe it. I listen to the people down deep in the organization that are on the fringes, interfacing with customers, suppliers, new tech. That's where innovation occurs. But at the same time, exactly with your Titanic story or the military, when you're getting shot at, shells are coming in, you don't form a task force and do a 360 feedback. It's command and control. You do this, I'll do that. And so you need both abilities to listen, to devolve, but at the same time, when it hits the fan, follow me, do this now, no questions asked, go. How do companies manage that Janus perspective, that duality? How do they do?
Yeah. while I like to think of myself as a great personnel manager, I'm not. And I know this because I had this big strapping guy who was my head of strategy for many years, Byron, and he was a former special forces operator. I mean, he was the kind of guy who, dropped out of airplanes, in Afghanistan to go and, hunt terrorists. And
So his strategy job was simple
spoke,
compared to his previous
yeah,
job.
spoke 7 languages, master's degree in business, master's degree in economics, I think in something else. He's one of those, smarter than me, also bigger than me. And so, one day he comes to me and he's just pissed because I walk in, I say, here's what needs to happen. Don't tell me, give me any guff. And then I walk away for 3 weeks and I don't respond, and the things that leaders do. And you come back and he's basically, it's one of those what the heck moments. And this guy's bigger than and he says, here's the deal. I will stop working for you unless you give me a command properly. When you are going behind enemy lines, is one of the most specialized special forces operators on the planet. Here's how you give a command. You say, here's what we know about the situation. Here's what we think is likely to change. Here's my objective structurally in the bigger picture. Here's my objective for you. Here's what I want you to do. If that doesn't work, here's your range of risk, your risk bands that you can take, right? That's really important. If you don't tell people how much and how little risk to take, they're going to take less than little, right? So how much and how little to take. If that doesn't work, who do you contact, right? If I don't come back, what do you do next? And
Right.
if you just say those things to your team, you've now given them all of the tools they need to innovate on your behalf without actually having told them exactly what to do. Right. And so you can operate in these highly ambiguous, highly uncertain, zero failure, critical risk environments, and have innovation at the same time. People just need to understand what are those parameters for innovation in those highly uncertain times. And so I don't know that it's a pure command and control, here's what you do now, versus pure innovation and let's go and do a jazz dance. Right. I think it's about that balance in between. It's about how we as leaders come across, how we give directions. And it's also about how as employees, we communicate back up, right? There's that contract of I will hear you if you communicate in the right way. And this goes back to Aristotle in so many ways, right? And his ideas about rhetoric, right? If you teach your people to use what I call the lead method, right? First say, what's the logic of what's going on? Ask, empathetically, here's what I understand your goal is in this situation. What am I missing?
Right.
Communicate what their point of authority is. Often it's not positional. Often they, maybe they had an experience when they were babysitting in 3rd grade, or they fixed something in their house, the water boiler in their house or something that's not related to your business. It gives them some insight that this iceberg might be different than the last one. And then what's the deadline? We can mess around with this for 3.5 weeks, but after that, here's the impact of the situation. These are basic executive communication skills, but often
Right.
we don't train our people in those skills below the director level, right? We've got to communicate. We've got to get those skills deeper in the organization if we want to get ahead of situations, both how we give directions and how people give feedback. If you link those two things together, then you create a situation where you can actually operate incredibly innovatively in highly uncertain situations. Know that you're getting what you need on the timeline that you need it to create the reliable results as a manager.
It's interesting. I wholeheartedly agree. What I've seen, the transition, and I admit I'm not a fan of Six Sigma. I mean, I understand the importance, the brilliance, but the problem for me with Six Sigma is it says there's one best way to do everything. and therefore you track people on, weekly, monthly progress,
Yep.
and you forget the goal that you're trying to achieve,
Yep.
right? You just look at, are you executing the play, right? And
Right.
so what I see, to use different words, I think what you're describing is many of the best managers I see basically give you bounded freedom. So, and the organizational values determine the playing field, right? And so anything you want to do inside this playing field, I don't care. I'm not going to look at you. I assume you're being rational. But if you step outside this safe zone, this bounded rationality, bounded freedom, then you and I have to talk about, because you violated some of these things where we set those limits, to use your word. And then a great manager will tell you, look, I think there's landmines based on my experience. This is a danger spot. This is a danger spot. Now, if you want to go there, it's up to you, but just be careful. Don't come cry if you get hurt, because I've told you, carry scissors this way, right? So it's that bounded freedom, right? I think that's exactly what you're saying that these guys do, is because you have to give people, you have to trust that they're operationally going to do the right thing if you give them the right perspective. And I think whether you call it values or these other words, but I think it's that bounded innovation that we see at different levels that is so critical to get the energy to change, to unfreeze the organization.
And in those performance-driven, Six Sigma-driven companies, I think that I agree with you, and I think that the deep work of the manager is to figure out how we can move from captaining or commanding, to coaching. Right? We can't always do it. There are criteria, and I'm going to lay out what some of them are to figure out when you have to captain and when you can coach. But almost always you're going to get better performance, better speed, better innovation if you can move toward this coaching mindset that I was just talking about how do you create those, give clear orders that create bounded freedom? How do you get clear communication going up, right? Your people need to understand the bigger picture so that they understand why they're being successful or failing, because they're going to have questions that you necessarily didn't already answer for them. 2, incentives. Are there incentives aligned with your incentives and those of the organization? If they aren't, then you typically have to captain, right? Do they have the skills that they need to innovate on your behalf? If they don't, then you have to captain. Right. And you kind of go down this list, and there's a detailed list in chapter 8 of the book where I talk about these criteria that shift you from captaining to coaching and enabling that bounded freedom, expanding that bounded freedom. The reality in times of disruption, like you said, is that the instinct is command and control, tighten the grip. The reality, though, is when everything goes to heck, what you need to do is, as much as you can, loosen that grip, because there are so many questions that you don't even know, much less know the answers to, that you need your brilliant people working on. Right. So it's this balance of getting that control while giving it up at the same time, so that people can innovate faster than you can tell them what to do. Because at the end of the day, when there's a hole in your boat, right, you need people bailing water faster than you can tell them what to do. How do you do that? How do you take advantage of that? How do you create that coordination without calling the stroke? Right.
The Apollo 13 crisis comes back to mind. Exactly. I absolutely, I think we're in violent agreement here. I think we both see the same things. You've just articulated it much better in your book. But you've solved the company problem. So let's think big issues for a minute. Forget companies, we got it. If we start to look at geopolitical systems, etc., let me lay out a couple of broad trends that I see that, my time in China and Siebes has just opened my eyes to.
Yeah.
And and I spend a lot of time in India also. Which if you look at most of the decacorns now in the world,
right,
over half are in India and China.
Yep.
Right. The US is now lagging in terms of the next seeds of innovation. And you could, and part of that, I fundamentally believe is China is the most advanced mobile culture in the world, right? In terms of payments, and China's going to roll out 5G more quickly than anybody else in the world. And you go to Shenzhen and you see these amazing innovation hubs that are going on.
Yeah.
It's just so.
Yeah.
Is China and Asia, including China, India, in terms of intellectual innovation? Wow, these guys are both on fire. What is the wave implication of that to the West, Europe and the US? Are these guys just producing a massive energy that is just going to capsize some of the traditional safe places in the US, such as Silicon Valley, where you are?
It's a question I think about a lot, being a property owner in Silicon Valley. In the book, I lay out 10 major trends that I think are going to shape the world over the next decade. And it's based on several years of research we did at HP to understand what we can and cannot know about the future. So it's based on a pretty rigorous foundation. So if you're interested in that question of what are these next rogue waves that are going to collide, these next smaller waves, undercurrents that are going to collide, independent of what happens next, that's a good place to start thinking about it. When I think about this idea of Asia first innovation, I absolutely agree with you. When I go to China, when I go to Beijing, Shenzhen, the thing that blows me away is, unlike going to Bangkok, for instance, where every time I go, it's an evolved city. Every time I go to Beijing, it's like a different city. I was brought a whole bunch of executives from HP over to China just to try and communicate the scale of change that's happening, because you cannot explain this like in a report. You have to go there and see it and feel it. And like, this is the most amazing economic change literally in human history, right? Is going on right now in China, and then, increasingly in India. What does this mean for the West? I think first you need to understand that this is an epochal event, right? This is a change in the nature of human civilization is what's happening. And if you sit in the West and you try and protect what you have, the reality is you're going to get bowled over. I mean, you're talking about 2 billion people, right, between China and India, all, in the next, we can decide what decade it is, but entering the US level middle class, or even half entering the US level middle class by 2050, 2070, you name it, right? That's going to cause massive resource constraints globally, right? It's going to cause climate governance to have to happen on a global basis. It's going to, I believe, make war and historical resource conflict impossible, to have this many powerful players all having to negotiate for the pie. So we're going to have to really rethink the nature of global governance over the next 50 years. And if we don't, you can kind of see where that moving from cooperation and collaboration to conflict goes, right? I think that outcome is so obviously unacceptable for all of the players, that we're going to have to figure out how to get along as a planet for the first time. I don't know how that rolls out, but I think it's a dramatically different world than the one I grew up in, the set of assumptions I grew up in. And I think it's the kind of world that I want to live in. It's going to be messy as all get out, getting from here to there. I think that we're going to have to deal with a lot of the old winners, having to accept that the ratio of assets and resources that are available to them. I think a lot of that has to do with automation, digitization, the virtual world, the virtual economy, what that becomes. I'm not saying that I'm a big, Web3 distributed finance, virtual reality advocate. But what I am saying that's going to become something different by the time it becomes something. But what I am saying is that we need to radically change the way that we distribute atoms across the planet, do it far more resource efficiently. And that requires all of these tools, not moving things we don't need to move, virtualizing the things that we can virtualize, figuring out how to automate resource extraction, move toward an electrical economy, do all of those things that are buzzwords now, to get from here to there in a safe way that's beneficial to all. And I think that our job as managers, our job as leaders, the bigger picture, not the 3-year picture, but the bigger picture, is how do we use our companies, how do we use our roles to enable that future to happen in a better way? And it's massive and it's big, and we've got to teach people about what this really looks like, and we've got to spend the time to really understand the role that each of us play in that outcome, because the alternative is so terrifying that none of us wanted, and I hope no one's going to want to go there.
I mean, again, the interconnectedness, we can't escape it, I think. But for good and bad, right? I mean, we're all in this together, so we solve these problems collectively, but also in terms of the talent wars, the idea, the innovation of companies. The idea that Silicon Valley is competing against Silicon Valley is crazy. I know many startups in China and India.
Silicon Valley is a place. Yeah, Silicon Valley is a place where deals get done because of Stanford and Berkeley. It's a significant research core for deep tech and biotech. But it's gotten so expensive to operate here as an early stage company. That's not what this is about. It's like Manhattan 30 years ago, right? Where 40 years ago, where there were businesses that weren't financial businesses, and there were companies that had major offices there that weren't deal making headquarters. But today it's so expensive to operate there that all of the back end operations have moved out.
The garment district is gone.
Yeah, well, there's some Prada stores, but
yeah, but the guys
but there's no garments. There's no Prada garments being made. Exactly.
But what I find that's interesting is what I was going to say is that some of these companies in India, the traditional logic is, you build a product, you market it in the US, and you do an IPO on NASDAQ. Increasingly, I hear companies in India and China say, why do I want to bother with the US? It's only 300 million people. The market's not big enough, right? And I think that's something that the West must realize, whether it's Europe or the US or whatever, that, the potential market size in India and China, and particularly China, because of the explosion of wealth, particularly in tier 2 cities, you're going to see, I mean, this is going to drive consumption and innovation, because this is where the market is. And I don't think many companies in the West fully appreciate the scale. I mean, to say, oh, you're 1 out of 1 million in China is not a big deal, right? I mean, just the size of the market, you can slice, dice, and segment the market so many ways. There's so much innovation, and it's a fascinating place for all these little waves to pop up.
I have an investor in a company that I started, who's a Chinese manufacturer. And he's basically pulled his company out of the US for exactly that reason. He's like, I've got all of the market I can absorb for this main thing that I do in China. Like, I don't need the West. And that was kind of fascinating, because he was educated in the West. He was sent over here, and to figure out how to open the market, all of those things. And the second that he took over the operating group, a family operating group, he said, no. Those people are moving way too slow. There's way more opportunity right here. And I think, when I talk to Western companies, the things that I hear, are one, that's not true, because it's never been true, which is foundationally wrong. The second thing that I hear is we can't operate profitably there. We can't operate profitably
Right.
in China. There's preferential treatment to local companies. And I look at that and I say that's not been my experience. Like, to some extent it's true. Same thing in the US, same thing in Europe. There's always a level of protectionism, but the bigger thing is China has always been very accepting to me, to things that I've done, to companies I've worked with, when a couple of things are true. One, we're adding to the knowledge set, we're adding to the economy, we're adding to the community, we're being of service, we're coming into this powerful, amazing country and culture with a respect that we are a small contributor to a long lineage. And when you come into China with that perspective, it is a very open place. When you come to China with the perspective that I am a Western leader, I am going to give you these great things because I come from this other place, that's not going to go over very well.
Right.
And it's
If
not
you
a
create
sustainable
value, not take value.
It's an extractive colonialist perspective, and it's not going to work. Right?
Exactly.
Especially in a country that has been so challenged by that Western perspective in the past. It's a great country. It's a great place to work. It's a great place to do business. If you want to be a part of the greatest change in human history.
I couldn't agree more. The last 10 years of me being in China have just opened my eyes in ways, I mean, things I couldn't imagine that I've seen happen firsthand. When I started at Siebes 10 years ago, I'm a believer in tech. Nobody believed. Somewhere along the way, it caught fire, and they've gone from non-believers to world leaders. It's just amazing to me. But since we're talking about China, let me ask one question that is so unique to China that I think many people in the West, don't they know of it, but they don't understand the potential implications of it, particularly from a rogue waves perspective. And obviously, you spent a lot of time in China, which is the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises. And many people say, "Oh, this is just about China, doing control and exercising their muscle and things like that." But from a rogue wave perspective, you could say maybe it's about creating stability. It's about calming, So I'd be very interested. How do you see this innovation and SOEs working together synergistically in China from a rogue waves perspective? Does that create an advantage, a disadvantage? Help me understand that.
I think that's a really complex question, because everything anybody could say is true. The first question from a macro perspective, right, is where are your buffers? Where is that consistency of employment? How do you maintain monetary velocity, when the economy slows down? In the US, we have a number of perspectives on that. We have a construction industry that's very mom and pop, that allows us to move money relatively quickly. We have tremendous amounts of military spending as a way to move money slowly but stably and distribute it across the country. And then we have food stamps, and we have social safety net that we use to move money really quickly when we need to. Right. And so these are many of the strategies we have in the US to do that. The challenge is when something like COVID happens, our expectations of companies in the US is that they have to live pretty much on their own, otherwise they die. And yet we're not set up to manage to sustain our critical infrastructure in that way. And so there was tremendous amount of backfilling. I think in many cases, inappropriate backfilling of companies that should not have survived COVID. And we're going to come to pay the price in the future of that in the United States. But, in China, it's a totally different model, right? Where you do have these large SOEs, they are buffers. They create that consistency of monetary flow through the economy. They often deal with parts of the economy that are not competitive and shouldn't be competitive, and will go to the lowest common denominator if they are. in those situations, I think SOEs are a really important part of the Chinese economy, and something that maybe the US, maybe Europe should consider. Okay, how do you adopt? The second thing that's fascinating to me about China is the level of competition in the more entrepreneurial parts of the economy. That there's some central control over what are we going to shape. We're gonna become a leader in. We were talking about 5G and telecom, full stack telecom. And we're just going to do that, and we're going to throw money at it, and we're going to throw bodies at it, and we're going to have massive competition to try and get there on the things where there should be massive competition. And we're going to pick winners in the places where there's one thing that has to get done. It's hard, and we know how to do it.
Right.
I think that's very wise if you can do that, if you can maintain that, if you can keep the companies clean, keep the operations clean. And that's really the challenge: is how do you do the corporate governance? How do you do the regulatory governance when you have such divergent economic strategies? So to the extent that's done well, I think it's an amazing country, an amazing place to operate, an amazing economy. I think it's something that the West really needs to learn from as well.
I mean, as you said, if you get it right, you truly have the best of both worlds, right? Efficiency plus innovation. And it seems like most countries, other countries, choose one or the other, right? And whereas, but let's take that to the next level. We think about SOEs and how there's sort of this dampening factor or this stable base. How would you interpret the One Belt, One Road initiative from a Rogue Waves? Yeah, because it's sort of, I'm expanding that stability beyond China to a region now, potentially. So how would you think about One Belt?
Well, so I think there's a question of there are two questions, right? What is the vision of One Belt, One Road? What is the governance of that vision, right? And then how is it funded, right? Are we going to really get the vision, consistency in terms of what we want, and the follow through? The Chinese perspective of we're going to throw a whole bunch of opportunity at this problem, and then we're going to tighten up and we're going to figure out our focus later. I think it's really wise if you want to build an innovation-led economy, and I think that's what's happening. My question as we come out of COVID and move into the next economic phase is, when you take a look at Southern Europe, it will come out of this pretty well decimated. You take a look at the non-tech, non-financial areas of the US, they're going to come out of this pretty well decimated. When you take a look at South America, right, an aging population that hasn't really made the jump into either of those two next areas of the global economy, right? The question is, who pays for that decimation, right? Who backfills, who helps build the new infrastructure? Is it going to be Germany that wants to build the infrastructure in Southern Europe? Historically, they really have required significant payback for that, or is it going to be China? In South America, does the Pax Americana really apply anymore, or is that going to be China? Right? Very interesting perspective that could shape the nature of human events, the nature of the geopolitical structure of the planet. I hope that this shift is gentle and kind and smooth. I think it's important for China to expand its influence outside of its boundaries, and to play that role as a global player, as a global benefactor, as a global change agent. Because, like I said, if we don't get everybody figuring out how to drive this efficiency, how to drive this potential on the planet, we're all going to pay. And so, as an American, I look at what goes on here and this lack of understanding of China and of the new Chinese role in the global economy. I'm concerned that this could be misunderstood as US-China competition, right? As opposed to a new pie, a new global world where the US may not be rising as fast, but China is coming to parity, on a per capita basis with the US,
Right.
and taking its rightful role on the planet. Right. And so we've got to manage that public relations side of the perspective, and understand that we all now have a role, right, as leading global economies in shaping that better future for all of us.
I think it highlights how almost everything is up for grabs these days. But when I was at the University of Oxford, and I would talk to history professors from a business school perspective, they said, you don't understand timelines, right? They said, if you could look for the last 1,000 years, up from to like 1200 AD, India and China were 50% of the GDP of the world, those two countries. And so we've gone through this last little, funny 100 years where maybe they were not the leaders, but maybe we're drifting back toward that kind of world where they resume their historically dominant place as leaders from a GDP perspective of the world. And I think if that happens, so many things are up for grabs then. Mm-hmm. But I'm conscious of time, and so I want to really let you give fatherly advice now, because I think your ideas are fascinating. But we have many MBAs that are 26 to 30 graduating, or executive MBAs that are a little bit older. What career advice would you give to a freshly graduated MBA from CEIBS? What would you tell them to do in terms from a road wave perspective? How would you think about career planning, the skills that you need to develop as a great leader and manager? What advice would you give?
Yeah. So I guess two things to think about. One, and this is going to be geeky for a second, and we'll get out of it, is to learn a little more about epistemology, which in philosophy is the study of how we know what we know. In a world of automation, in this world of radical change, right, our role as managers is really to help our people figure out how to know more about the situation so that they can operate differently, so that they can operate more efficiently, so that they can operate more innovatively. And there are four major ways of thinking about unknown situations. You can look at it like, and these are caricatures, because I know there's going to be a lawyer, there's going to be a scientist, there's going to be an economist on this call. I know they're caricatures, but think about the world deductively like a lawyer. If all of the facts, the universe of facts are there, what must be true? Think about the world like a scientist. Given the facts that we know about the situation, what is the most likely thing to be true? Or think about, and that's called inductive reasoning. Think about the world like an economist, and this is called Bayesian reasoning, saying, okay, here's a black box. We don't know what's in that thing, but we know all of the stuff that's connected to it. When we put something in here, what comes out here? That's called Bayesian reasoning. And that's going to be more important. That's central to how we think about machine learning and artificial intelligence, that type of thing. It's an increasingly important skill to have as a manager. And the last piece is what's called abductive reasoning. And this is thinking like an artist, saying, okay, what would happen if some fact that we knew to be true turned out to be untrue? Like, how would that change my perspective on the situation? Or what if something radical changed? How would that change my perspective on the situation? So much of scientific management training has been about increasing our inductive and our deductive capabilities, thinking like a lawyer, thinking like a scientist. The next generation of leaders are going to have to master Bayesian reasoning. They're going to have to master abductive reasoning. They're going to have to think like lawyers and scientists, but also like economists and like artists. So what are the small things you can do in your life, in your decision-making, in your next meeting, to start to tease out these other ways of thinking? So that would be my like leadership advice, like career leadership advice. The second is an article, and that there's an article about that, I think, coming out with PMI and Thinkers 50 shortly. There's another article in HBR that I wrote recently about career advice with my friend Dory Clark. And in it, we talk about taking wargaming, right, which we do in business and we do in military, and applying it to your career. And the first thing I suggest is, go to your parents' friends, and ask them what happened in their life that they didn't expect. Getting sick, having a partner get sick, having a child die, having a career reset at age 50. What are those range of things that we already know can happen to our careers, and how do we make small steps today that increase our optionality and our potential, no matter what happens, no matter what unexpected thing occurs next. And if you do that, I'm kind of telling you to eat your broccoli, to eat your vegetables. I know. But if you do that over time, what you discover is that even though you don't know how things will work out, you know that they will work out, and that you start operating with greater ease and a greater flywheel to move you forward, because you have better intellectual tools to get there, and you've made better foundational decisions in your career, in your life, to get where you want to go, no matter what happens next.
Excellent. It sounds like we need to offer a few new electives at CEIBS then, to get this more holistic perspective.
I'd be glad to come and do that.
Excellent. It's been a fascinating whirlwind to see the world through your eyes. But we have many people online, et cetera. We thought to try to make this more efficient. We have a few questions that we've gathered from them, and maybe we have time for one or two questions before we wrap up from the audience.
I would love that.
The first one: innovation is often considered one way for companies to deal with radical change, but it requires significant investments. So how do companies who innovate cope with the risk of innovation? Mm-hmm. Because quite often it's a winner-take-all world, right? There's not many points for second place. So what do we do?
So I think within that is a question of, where do you innovate? So it's so easy to innovate on, we're going to make this, what color button, what shape of the, should this device be, what feature should we put on into our system? So easy to do that because you can win that on a quarterly basis. The overall cost of that type of innovation versus the payout for a lot of companies, not necessarily there. But when you start looking more deeply at, no matter what happens next, how do I increase the reliability and the efficiency of my finances, my operations, my external environment, and my strategy? And how do I do that for my customers when they're disrupted? What you find is that's a focusing mechanism for where to innovate next. And in the book, we talk about some sort of game theoretic models. And I, just because we're a bunch of MBAs here, I'll say that's what it is. But about what I call risk switches. I think I call them something slightly different in the book. But what happens if I move this thing from a synchronous risk to an asynchronous risk, a risk that impacts everybody, to a risk, everybody at the same time, to some people at sometimes, or a symmetric risk that impacts everybody, to an asymmetric risk that impacts only some people. So an example of what I'm talking about is the Daiichi nuclear power plant in China. There was a disaster, and it totally disrupted Toyota's manufacturing capability. There were components that were locally produced, couldn't produce them. So these are the people who really invented lean manufacturing, right? These guys are leanest, greenest, most efficient, manufacturers, heavy manufacturers on the planet. And they say, wait a second, this is really interesting. When the world changes, our Six Sigma driven, it's not Six Sigma there, but we were talking about Six Sigma before. So optimization, modular engineering driven approach breaks down. What are the 250 components in our cars that, if that happens, are going to disrupt our entire ecosystem? Well, one of those things that they discovered was semiconductors that are produced in Taiwan. So they figured out how to hedge, how to have access to a 6-month supply of these things. in case there's something like that again. 2016, I believe, Taiwan natural disaster, entire ecosystem, car manufacturers are disrupted. Toyota runs through smooth. COVID hits, same thing happens. Toyota's had some problems later on. 2020 was a terrible time for automobile manufacturers, as you might know, because no one bought cars because no one was going anywhere. Toyota became the largest automobile manufacturer on the planet because they had a stable supply chain through the first phase of COVID. And my point is, when you start looking at this bigger picture, where your finances, your operations, your external environment, and your strategy are going to be disrupted, that helps you focus where to innovate, so that when the world changes, you have blue ocean when it's red for everybody else.
Absolutely, absolutely. Last question. All these rogue waves, disruptions that we've been talking about, I mean, there's obviously the potential to widen the gap between the rich and the poor, between the developed and undeveloped. But is it also an opportunity to promote greater equality? And if so, how can we make sure that that's more likely than, the greater separation? How can we, when the kayak rights itself, to use your word, right? How do we say, okay, it's a level playing field, or it's more level?
So I think within this, this is a PhD dissertation scale question, right?
If not several.
If not several, it's a Nobel Prize level question.
Exactly.
So when I think about inequality, I think about three things really. The first is sort of historical inequality, right? Access to goods, access to core infrastructure. The second is financial inequality, and a world where automation is going to digitize more and more things that used to be expensive and used to be physical, right? How do we create equality there? And then the third piece is really about infrastructure inequality. How do when you take a look at a lot of waste coming down the Ganges, right? Like waste in the 13 or so major rivers in the world that are feeding plastic waste into the ocean. Why is that? Well, if you've got a bed and you're in wherever and there's no roads, how do you get rid of it? Right? Toss it down the river. Right? It's not that people want to do that, it's that they don't have access to infrastructure. And so what we need to be doing moving forward, is thinking from an investment perspective. How do we create, product, financial, and infrastructure equality? From a governance perspective, how do we redistribute more effectively? How do we redistribute wealth more effectively? We were talking about SOEs versus what goes on in the US, right? Different strategies for wealth redistribution. So we've got to figure out how to do that more effectively. And from an infrastructure perspective, I think we need to move from a competition for global infrastructure development. You can buy the American, the Western package or the Chinese package, to one where we are competing as a planet to create as much opportunity as efficiently as possible for as many people as possible, because it is completely unacceptable on this planet, in our species, that billions of people don't have access to basic things like latrines. Like billions of people don't have access to basic healthcare. Billions of people don't this is structurally unacceptable to me as a human, that we live in this place where this is happening, and yet the wealth is there to make it possible. We've got to figure out how we're going to do that better.
I think that's a challenge for us as well as our students. So thank you very much for your time and your insights today, Jonathan. It's been a real pleasure having you in the SIEVS intellectual community, and we hope to welcome you again. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
your time.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeffrey.